Hi there, my name is Tony. I'm a junior outreach officer over at Elections Canada. I've been there for about 6 months. So Elections Canada's main role and the reason why it exists is to be able to be prepared to run Canada's federal elections, Canada's federal by-elections, as well as Canadian federal referendums. So what does that mean? Elections Canada is there to be an independent, nonpartisan officer that reports directly to Parliament. And our role and our reason for existence is to make sure that every single Canadian has a right to be able to vote in a safe, secure, and accessible election, regardless of wherever they are in the country. And what Elections Canada does in order to achieve that is making sure that Canadians know what they need to be able to vote. They know what the rules and requirements are, and they also make sure that Canadians and candidates adhere to the rules that exist within the Canadian Elections Act. Whether it's political financing requirements, whether it's ID requirements, or whether it's making sure that we keep our elections safe and accessible for all. So one of the main goals of Elections Canada is to make sure that Canadian federal elections are secure as well as accessible to Canadians. And accessible means a variety of different things, right? Accessible means that making sure that every single Canadian, wherever they are in the country, has the right and the ability to be able to vote in an election. So that includes electors with disabilities, folks who have a bit of a harder time maybe getting to a polling station, have a little bit of a harder time filling out their ballot. Part of what Elections Canada's mandate is to make sure that electors, regardless of what their abilities are, have the ability to be able to cast a ballot. So let's say, for example, electors with disabilities. Let's say an elector with a mobile disability. One of Elections Canada's mandates and one of our goals is to make sure that polling stations right across the country are able to accommodate and are able to assist voters of all abilities to be able to cast their ballot. Making sure that they're wheelchair accessible, making sure that when an elector comes to the table, that the staff there working for Elections Canada are there to be able to assist and to be able to provide information and resources and tools to an elector to be able to make sure they can cast their ballot. So, that can include a magnifying glass, that can include bigger pencils, that can include a reader, a divider, or for example, for electors who are visually impaired, a braille reader, to make sure that every single Canadian, regardless of what their abilities are, can cast the ballot. And that can also includes our electors that are in the north, that may have a bit of a harder time making their way over to a polling station that is far away from them. One of the ways that Elections Canada ensures that every single Canadian can vote is, for example, through mechanisms like special ballots, where somebody can request a mail-in ballot sent to their home that they can fill out and have send it back over to their local returning office to make sure that their vote counts. We're also talking about advanced polls, those polls where folks can come in a couple of days before an election and be able to cast their ballot, so that way, if they're busy on election day, they don't need to worry. And for example, at your local returning office, once an election is called, you have the right to be able to go to your local returning office during their opening hours to be able to cast your ballot ahead of time. And those are the kind of mechanisms that exist to make sure that Canadians are able to access their democratic rights. So Elections Canada, the way that we ensure fairness and that we ensure that your elections are run in an impartial manner is to make sure that we follow to the T the Canada Elections Act. And a lot of that also talks about the different ways that we govern parties. For example, what Elections Canada does during an election is making sure that candidates and parties are compliant with the rules and restrictions and the regulations that exist within the Canada Elections Act. So, for example, that includes spending limits, making sure that federal political parties and that candidates, regardless of their political stripe, adhere and make sure that they are well within the boundaries set within the Canada Elections Act, when it comes to how they campaign, when it comes to how they raise money, when it comes to how they report their finances. What Elections Canada does is making sure that all candidates adhere to those kind of guidelines, and we level the playing field among all candidates within a riding. So, when we, let's say for example, we're in a riding, when we look at all candidates, Every single candidate is the same. Every single candidate has the same rules and responsibilities. Every single candidate, for example, has to have an official agent. Every single candidate has to report their finances at the end of the campaign. Every single candidate has to keep track of their spending, and every single candidate, whenever they're raising money, they have to make sure that they keep track of that information as well. That doesn't, those rules and restrictions apply whether or not somebody is a part of a party or is running independently. And a lot of what Elections Canada does is provide information, provide guidance to these parties as well, and consult with parties and consult with candidates to make sure that every single person, regardless of what their role is within the Canadian election, knows what the rules and the regulations are. Because the last thing we want is a candidate or anybody feeling like they weren't informed when they got involved, and that they feel that they didn't have the information they need to be able to go about things in a fair way that adheres to regulations. So a lot of what Elections Canada does is make sure that whether it's you, whether it's you're a voter down the street, or whether it's a candidate, knows what your responsibilities are to make sure that our elections are fair and accessible.